Do this one more time. So I want to recap a little bit of what we talked about the last time we were together, and we talked about this idea of affinity bias, right? So this in-group, out-group, and double standards bias, and so we talked a little bit about affinity bias being developed mostly because of where you've grown up, how you've grown up, the people who gave you your paradigm also had blind spots that they were that they held themselves, right? So this idea that we all have blind spots. And so what I'd like to leave you with as we move into this next section is it's all right that we have these blind spots. It's all right that we see the world the way that we do until we recognize that we need a change. And when we recognize that we need a change or we need to do things differently, that's when our behaviors, our actions, our mindsets need to be adjusted to make sure that we're able to reach our goals. And so I would go as far as to say that it's all right for someone to have the emotional state of feeling bigotry or being a bigot, that they can have that as their behavior, as their emotional state. However, if they act on that behavior, that becomes unacceptable, right? So we have rules and guidelines and laws that protect people from acting out of things that society deems as not socially acceptable, right? So this affinity bias. So we all have bias, but it's more important to recognize what we do or how that bias manifests, right? So some other topics that we're going to cover in this piece is this idea of fit. So what is the right fit? What are in groups and out groups? How do we manage in groups and out groups? Why do all the black kids sit at the lunch table together? And that's a book that we'll kind of talk about a little bit. And then how do we overcome double standard bias and develop an equity lens? And so actually, what is an equity lens? But we'll get to that in just a second. So affinity bias is also known as similarity bias. It is the tendency for people to like to connect with people who are like them, right? I mean, so that's a natural thing in developing social groups, right? So you want to find those social groups. However, when that becomes an exclusive process that says, not only do I want to be with people like me, but I only want to be with people like me. I only want to be around, or I only want people who think like me to be around. There could be some opportunities that we're missing, right? So problem solving, creative thinking, getting out of our tunneled mindsets is very difficult when we surround ourselves with people that are just like us. And so we have to recognize that bias is natural, that we all come from context. We all have bias. And we have to ask the question or think about, how is it that my bias is serving me? What purpose does that bias serve? I will submit to you that some people say we need to eliminate bias. And I don't know that we can. I think we can reassign our bias, right? Or replace our bias with something other than the bias that is created. But I don't know that we can actually eliminate bias. And we may not want to, right? So there's some biases that we have that are a part of those kind of quick thinking pieces, right? So our brain doesn't have a whole lot of time to process tons of information. So it looks for these context clues. It looks for these things. And so we have certain biases that actually serve us well. However, we have to recognize when they don't, right? So when do we need to recognize our biases or challenge our biases? When they're not helping us reach our goals. So when we think about this in-group and out-group perspective, it's important for us to recognize that we're oftentimes in both groups, or can be in both groups, depending on the context, right? So context is everything. Context is very important, because if you don't understand the context, then you actually don't understand the behavior that someone is exhibiting, or the relationships that people have developed. And so it's important to recognize the importance of context. We'll come back and talk more about context a little bit later, but I want to talk about this in group and out group. So people often ask, so what is an in group? And I would simply say that an in group is the group that has the largest or the most amount of influence. Sometimes they're a small group that have a lot of influence, that have a lot of access to power, yeah. So some people would say privilege. I don't want to go there yet, but we'll talk about that as well, right? So this in group, they have influence, they have power, they can get things done. And so I want you to think about in groups that you might be a part of, right? So another example would be like sports teams, right? So if you went to high school in the United States, sports teams there's a hierarchy in K-12 education, in high school, and athletes oftentimes are on that spectrum of the hierarchy, right? So they're typically either at the top, and depending on what part of the country you are, it could be ice hockey, that is the most popular sport in a high school. It could be football or basketball, depending on where you are. And this is a small subset of people, but they get known as being the popular kids, or the jocks, or the kids who get preferential treatment by other kids. And so think about groups that you've either been a part of or that you've noticed that get this preferential treatment. Sometimes it's a small group, but they have a huge impact. And then there are the out groups. And the out groups have a particular kind of mindset as well. And these out groups are if we use the K-12 example, are students who don't get the same affluence, the same respect, the same use of power as other groups, right? So if we use, football as an example, football players may get a certain level of respect within an educational community that is different than the drill team or the band, right? So there are those types of groups. And so what I'd like for you to do is to just think about what are some out groups that you have also been a part of, right? So there are in groups and there are out groups. Another way to think about this is in business meetings or in organizational meetings, there are the extroverts and then there are the introverts. And so introverts typically are considered the in group, right? Because when we think about traditional leadership styles, those traditional leadership styles play very well to those extroverts. However, we also know that introverts can be equally effective as a leader, but oftentimes those aren't the sought after skills that for leadership. And so this in group and out group can cause this dichotomy, the separation between groups of people. And so when we think about the in group mindset, how do they see themselves? How do they see the world? What you think about the attitudes that the in group might have, either about itself or about others, and then what are the behaviors that come along with this in group, right? And then secondly, the out group. What are some of the mindsets? What are the attitudes? What are the behaviors of that out group? So when we also think about organizations, sometimes people talk about the right fit, right? And so this idea of fit is oftentimes problematic because it is typically done on the back end. So you'll go through an interview process, or you'll engage someone in an application process, and then people will say, this person wasn't the right fit for this organization, for us. What's the problem with that? The problem typically is that the standards haven't been set ahead of time so that the people who are making this judgment call have something substantial to kind of balance that thought process off of or towards, right? And the other thing that's problematic is oftentimes we're judging people on something that we haven't told them that we're judging them on, right? So we'll judge people for this fit. We'll judge people for fitting in, or we'll even have these organizational norms that we may not that are sometimes unwritten norms that we don't even tell candidates. We don't tell people who want to enter our organization. So then we're unfairly judging them on something that they could not have been known that they're being judged on, right? So what is this idea of fit? Now, are there certain characteristics? Are there certain ways of being that are acceptable in workplaces, or that workplaces want people who have certain kinds of traits so that they can fit in and get along? Certainly we do. Certainly we have those. So the problem isn't necessarily looking for fit. The question or the problem, the challenge is, how do you define fit ahead of time and people that this is the looking for so that they can prepare for those jobs. Unfortunately, or those opportunities. Unfortunately, we've used this idea of fit as a cop-out to not allow people or extend to people offers to join our organizations. So I want you to think about a time when you were in an organization where you fit. What did that fit look like? What did it feel like? What did that fit mean for you, right? And so we'll continue on. So the in groups have open expressive tendencies and feel a sense of entitlement, and this all happens in their context, right? Out groups typically are small subsets, limited access to influence and power, and in a particular context. Patricia. This. You're killing me, Smalls.